On October 12, 1969, DJ Russ Gibb from WKNR received a very mysterious call from one of his listeners. The listener was identified only as Tom, and Tom encouraged Russ and his listeners to listen to two Beatle tracks. Those two Beatle tracks were Revolution Number 9 and Strawberry Fields Forever. Now, around this time, college student Tim Harper wrote an article for his college newspaper. Now, that article opened up a whole new can of worms. Beatle fans were searching for clues everywhere. And guess what, folks? Those clues just weren't on their songs. Those clues appeared to even be on their album covers. Now, the story goes that on November 11th, 1966, Paul McCartney and the Beatles were in the recording studio and evidently got into a heated discussion that resulted in Paul McCartney leaving in disgust, getting into his Aston Martin, picking up along the route a young lady named Rita, and right after getting into a horrible car crash that he did not survive. In fact, some clues seem to indicate that he was even decapitated. All right, folks, this is going to be part one of a couple of videos that I'm going to be putting out regarding the whole Paul McCartney death hoax, death myth, or death reality. You see, after that call we talked about and that article we talked about, it seemed that every monkey's uncle got in on the act, didn't they? After all, the Beatles were big, and any discussion on this group sold papers, sold TV shows, and sold radio shows as well. We even got famous radio DJ Alex Bennett involved doing a serious research on the whole subject, as well as famed attorney F. Lee Bailey doing a special, almost putting Paul McCartney on trial. All right, so after that supposed accident, supposedly, the three Beatles, of course, were in shock, and they were even contacted by British Secret Intelligence. Together, the British Secret Intelligence and the Beatles put together a plan. First of all, they found one William Campbell, supposedly a contest winner in a Paul McCartney look-alike contest. He looked so close to Paul that he only needed minor corrective surgery. That would explain why Paul McCartney wound up with a mustache for the first time as a Beatle on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The eagle-eyed fans noticed that Paul McCartney actually had a scar on his lip despite that mustache, never mind the fact that Paul McCartney actually cut his lip in a moped accident. He even knocked out one of his teeth. You can see the results of that even earlier than Sgt. Pepper, when the Beatles released rock's first two so-called MTV videos, in my mind anyway, Paperback Writer and Rain. If you take a close look at those videos, you'll notice that Paul is missing a tooth. He's just stuck some white gum up there, but if you notice, it doesn't quite look the same from shot to shot. You see, he had to keep moving it so that they could do the video. And to those suspicious clue hunters, it seemed rather odd that the rest of the Beatles grew facial hair all at the same time. They thought that was to deflect our eyes from the fact that, well, Paul wasn't Paul anymore. But you know, it wasn't long before fans found other clues to Paul McCartney's demise. And as things went along, to tell you the truth, many of the clues that were given as legitimate were just based on absolute rubbish. And some of that rubbish we're going to cover in tonight's video, because tonight we're going to focus on the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, if there was ever a cornucopia of clues regarding Paul McCartney dying, this album, well, It takes the cake, doesn't it? Now, the album cover basically came together like this. You had the front photo, right? You had the inner gate sleeve. Make sure everybody can see that. And of course, the famous back cover that for the first time included Beatle lyrics. And there are clues galore on this album. Now, first of all, just look at the setting here, right? Okay, it's obviously set up as a funeral with tons of photos of famous and not so famous people on the cover behind the Beatles. We also have the famous waxed figures of the Beatles in attendance, as well as the Beatles as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band center stage. In front of them is a flower arrangement. And when you put all of those things kind of together, your first impression is that this is a funeral, a memorial at the least. Now, I'm not going to get into the plethora of people in the background there, okay? Although there are a few clues there as well. Now, one of the very first things that came to clue hunters was that in that flower arrangement, one of those arrangements was of Paul's famous left-hand Hofner bass. And the very astute could even see that those flowers spelled out the name Paul with a question mark right behind it. And there are only 3 strings on that left-hand bass. The bass is a 4-string instrument, folks. So all of these fans started thinking, well, this is the way of the Beatles telling us that the Paul McCartney on the cover is no more the real Paul McCartney than the wax dummy that's on the cover as well. And those 3 strings represented the only Beatles that were left: John, George, and Ringo. And as far as the flower arrangement that spells Beatles, if you take a closer look at it, just preceding Beatles is an almost 3. In other words, 3 Beatles left. To the far right, you notice that there's a Shirley Temple doll that has been dressed in a Rolling Stones sweatshirt. On her knee is a toy car resembling Paul McCartney's Aston Martin. And the old figure that's holding the Shirley Temple doll is holding her, and on her left hand, Paul McCartney was left, is a bloody driving glove. Now, the one thing I did want to focus on all of those background characters behind the Beatles was the hand that's extended behind Paul McCartney's head. Now, I'm not going to get into that tonight, but it is a death clue, folks. That'll be in a latter part of this series, because let's just say this is not the first time that Paul McCartney would be photographed with a mysterious hand over his head. But take a look at the instruments that the Beatles, as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, are holding. Paul McCartney is the only one to hold a wooden black instrument. All the other Beatles are holding brass instruments. Many fans saw that as not only as a sign of mourning Paul, but they also brought up that it's the only instrument made of wood, and that because it was made of wood, it represented a coffin. Now, the centerpiece of the front cover and smoking gun, evidently, is none other than Ringo Starr's drumhead. If you notice the title, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, there are 2 portions of that title that have the same font: Sgt. Pepper's Club Band. You see, Lonely Hearts is placed right in the middle of that drumhead. And some very creative fans found out that if you held a mirror absolutely to the center of that, instead of Lonely Hearts, you got this message: 1, 1, 1, X, he die. And that diamond, what is that diamond pointing to? Follow it upwards, and it is identifying faux-Paul. Now, when I first saw that, I thought it meant 1, 1, 1, and an X. In other words, one of the Beatles was X'd out. And then how? Well, he die. But you could also look at those numbers in another way. The first two ones could mean the 11th month, and that one before an X would be 9. 11, 9. So now that gives us a date. 1109, he die. Who? Paul. How do we get 1966? By those other clues that we discussed. His accident, facial scars and everything, and most clues beginning at this point. But let's get on to the inner gatefold sleeve. First of all, it appears the Beatles are carrying Paul here. You can clearly see his knees as he's put himself into an almost lotus position, and the Beatles appear to be standing right next to him. And then there's that mysterious patch on Paul McCartney's shoulder with the initials that appeared to many fans to be OPD. They surmised this stood for officially pronounced dead. Actually, the patch's initials was OPP, which stood for the Ontario Provincial Police. But McCartney even seemed to think that it was an OPD patch because he said that it stood for the Ontario Police Department. Now on the back cover, Paul McCartney is facing away from us, isn't he? If you notice, down the small of his back, his uniform has 3 black buttons. Again, like those 3 black strings on the base on the front cover. Many fans surmised that there were only 3 Beatles left, and really in this photo, we only see the faces of those 3 Beatles. Now right about Paul McCartney's head are the lyrics to Within You, Without You. Many people saying that this whole song was written by George about Paul being dead. But if you look at George's hand, what is he pointing to? He's pointing to the lyrics, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. So with all of these clues we've discussed, many fans felt that Paul McCartney died November 9th, 1966, which was, by the way, folks, Wednesday, and it happened at 5 a.m. How do we know that? Well, John tells us in A Day in the Life, doesn't he? He blew his mind out in a car. He was so angry he hadn't noticed that the lights had changed. And now we know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. And it's interesting, my 2 favorite tracks on the album are Within You, Without You by George Harrison and John Lennon, and supposedly Paul McCartney's magnificent A Day in the Life. And both of these songs seem to follow some of the hints.